Imagine a fighter plane so unusual that American pilots laughed at it, dismissed it as a failure, and begged never to fly it into combat. Yet, across the frozen skies of the Eastern Front, the very same machine became the trusted weapon of Soviet aces who carved their legends in blood and steel. This is not just a story about an aircraft. It's a story about perception, adaptation, and survival. The P-39 Airacobra was considered a reject by the United States, too slow for high-altitude dogfights and outdated before it even saw war. But when this misfit crossed the ocean and fell into Soviet hands, it was reborn as a secret weapon, an aircraft perfectly matched to the brutal, low-altitude brawls over Russia. So how did a plane Americans hated turn into a machine the Soviets adored? Strap in, because this is the untold saga of the P-39 Airacobra. The P-39 Airacobra was unlike anything else in the sky when it first appeared. Designed by Bell Aircraft, it was the first production fighter to place its engine in the middle of the fuselage, directly behind the pilot, with a long drive shaft powering the propeller up front. This strange design gave the cockpit a streamlined nose and room for something no other American fighter carried. A 37 W100 cannon firing straight through the propeller hub. On paper, it was revolutionary, a heavily armed interceptor meant to shred bombers and terrify enemies. But reality was cruel. By the time the Airacobra reached service, its advanced turbocharger had been stripped away due to production issues, leaving it sluggish at high altitudes. For the United States Army Air Forces, locked in battles high above Europe and the Pacific, this was a death sentence. A fighter that couldn't breathe above 15,000 feet was useless. And so, the P-39 was cast aside almost as quickly as it arrived. To American pilots, the P-39 was a frustrating contradiction. It had punch, but no reach. Its 37mm cannon was devastating if it hit, but the gun's slow rate of fire made aiming difficult. It was nimble down low, but climbed poorly. Against the agile Japanese Zero or the high-flying German Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Airacobra was outclassed. Stories spread quickly of pilots ditching their Airacobras at the first chance, desperate to trade them for a Mustang, a Thunderbolt, or even a Warhawk. The U.S. Army Air Forces relegated the plane to training, reconnaissance, and second-line duties. To the American public, the P-39 was simply a failed fighter. Newspapers never celebrated it. Pilots rarely praised it. And in the hangars of American bases, rows of unwanted Airacobras sat gathering dust, unwanted and unloved. But war has a way of finding uses for the unwanted. With the U.S. ramping up production of more advanced fighters, the Airacobra was suddenly available in massive numbers. Through the Lend-Lease program, America began shipping thousands of its so-called rejects to its desperate allies. And when the Soviet Union received its first batches of P-39s, something remarkable happened. Soviet pilots didn't dismiss the Airacobra. They embraced it. Unlike the Americans, the Soviets weren't fighting at 30,000 feet. Their war was fought low, brutal, and fast, where the Airacobra thrived. In dogfights over tank columns, in strafing runs across the snow, in duels barely above treetop level, the P-39's flaws vanished and its strengths exploded into relevance. The Soviet Union had a unique battlefield environment. Most air combat occurred below 15,000 feet, with fighters providing direct support to ground forces or intercepting enemy planes harassing front lines. In this world, the Airacobra was not a failure. It was perfection. The heavy 37mm cannon could rip apart German bombers and even punch through armored vehicles. The mid-engine design provided a stable gunnery platform, allowing Soviet pilots to score precise hits. And unlike the flimsy, lightweight fighters of earlier years, the P-39 was tough, capable of taking punishment and still returning home. Suddenly, the reject was no longer a burden. It was an asset, a weapon reshaped by circumstance and battlefield necessity. For Soviet pilots, the Airacobra wasn't America's embarrassment. It was Russia's treasure. When Soviet pilots first sat inside the P-39, they immediately noticed its strengths. The cockpit layout was modern and clear, visibility was excellent, and the sturdy airframe inspired confidence. Unlike the fragile Yak and Lend-Lease fighters, the Airacobra felt solid, like it could take a hit and still keep flying. The tricycle landing gear, rare for fighters at the time, made takeoffs and landings safer, especially on rough Soviet airstrips covered in snow and mud. Pilots loved the massive 37-100 cannon, nicknaming it the flying shotgun, because a single hit could turn a German fighter or bomber into smoking wreckage. To them, this was not a flawed American experiment. It was a reliable partner in a fight where survival was everything. The Soviet Air Force valued psychological impact as much as physical firepower, and the Airacobra delivered both. German pilots who once dismissed Soviet aircraft suddenly found themselves facing P-39s tearing through the sky with brutal firepower. A single burst could shatter the illusion of Luftwaffe superiority. The cannon's massive shells didn't just damage enemy aircraft. They terrified pilots who saw their comrades obliterated in one shot. The P-39 gave Soviet aviators confidence, a sense that they now had a machine equal, or even superior, to the German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. In the brutal chess game of aerial warfare, confidence was a weapon, and the Airacobra gave it in abundance. Some of the Soviet Union's greatest aces carved their reputations behind the controls of the Airacobra. Alexander Pokryshkin, one of the highest-scoring Allied pilots of World War II, scored the majority of his victories flying the P-39. He developed new tactics suited to the aircraft's strengths, using its speed and firepower in sudden, devastating strikes. Other legendary names like Grigory Rekhalov and Nikolai Gulev also turned the Airacobra into a symbol of Soviet aerial dominance. These men proved that the Airacobra was not a reject. It was a killer, a plane that, in the right hands, could rewrite the balance of power in the skies. Part of the Airacobra's success came down to the nature of Soviet combat. While the US and Britain needed long-range, high-altitude fighters to escort bombers deep into enemy territory, the Soviets fought a different kind of war. Their battles were close to the front lines, short in distance but intense in ferocity. Aircraft didn't need to climb to the stratosphere or fly hundreds of miles. They needed to survive the chaos of frontline warfare. In this environment, the P-39's supposed weaknesses became irrelevant. Its low-altitude performance, heavy weapons, and durability were exactly what Soviet pilots required. The mismatch that doomed it in American service became the very reason for its triumph in Soviet hands. The sheer number of P-39s that flowed into Soviet service is staggering. Of the more than 9,500 Airacobras built, nearly half were sent to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease. They became a backbone of Soviet fighter regiments, not a stopgap but a central pillar of their air force. By the war's end, the Airacobra had scored thousands of kills against the Luftwaffe and helped secure Soviet dominance in the skies of the Eastern Front. In America, the P-39 was forgotten, overshadowed by Mustangs and Thunderbolts. In Russia, it was remembered as a hero, a trusted companion that carried its pilots through some of the fiercest air battles in history. One of the defining features of the P-39 was its monstrous 37mm cannon mounted right through the propeller hub. American pilots often complained about its slow rate of fire and limited ammunition, but Soviet aviators saw it differently. To them, this weapon was a game-changer. It could obliterate a German fighter with a single hit or tear through the armored sides of a Ju-88 bomber. On the ground, it doubled as an anti-armor weapon, capable of shredding half-tracks, trucks, and even lightly armored tanks during strafing runs. In an air war where Soviet pilots often had only a few precious seconds to fire before breaking away, one powerful, devastating shot was worth far more than a long burst of rifle-caliber bullets. The Airacobra's cannon became a symbol of Russian efficiency: one shot, one kill. The Soviets quickly adapted their tactics to get the most out of the Airacobra. Unlike the Americans, who tried to use it in high-altitude roles, the Soviets trained their pilots to fight at low and medium altitudes, where the P-39 excelled. They used tight formations, ambush tactics, and sudden diving strikes to unleash the cannon's devastating firepower. Soviet engineers also modified the aircraft to better suit their needs, adjusting radios, winterizing equipment, and sometimes stripping unnecessary weight to improve performance. It was this flexibility, this willingness to adapt, that turned the Airacobra into a tool of victory. Where Americans saw a failed experiment, the Soviets saw a blank canvas ready to be painted with blood and courage. The Eastern Front was unlike any other theater of World War II. It was vast, brutal, and unforgiving. Airfields were often little more than frozen stretches of dirt, and combat happened at treetop level. This environment punished fragile, high-performance fighters but rewarded rugged, reliable machines. The P-39 thrived in these conditions. Its tricycle landing gear meant it could handle rough runways. Its armor protected pilots from small, arms fire during low-strafing runs, and its heavy cannon gave Soviet squadrons the punch they needed against German armor columns. In the crucible of the Eastern Front, the Airacobra proved that success wasn't about being the best on paper. It was about being the right tool for the battlefield. Alexander Pokryshkin, perhaps the greatest champion of the Airacobra, turned the aircraft into a legend. He rewrote Soviet air combat doctrine, abandoning rigid formations and instead teaching pilots to fight flexibly, using altitude, surprise, and the P-39's firepower to maximum effect. His motto, hate, speed, maneuver, fire, became the mantra of Soviet pilots. Flying the Airacobra, Pokryshkin scored over 50 confirmed kills, making him one of the highest scoring Allied aces of the war. His success was not just personal. It inspired entire squadrons to trust their Airacobras, to fight harder, and to believe that even against the fearsome Luftwaffe, victory was possible. To German pilots, the sudden appearance of P-39s over the Eastern Front was a shock. For years, the Luftwaffe had dismissed Soviet aircraft as inferior, easy prey for their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. But the Airacobra changed the equation. Its cannon could shatter a Bf-109 in a single hit, and its durability meant it could take punishment that would down a Yak or La-GG. German reports began to note the dangerous effectiveness of American aircraft in Soviet hands. The irony was sharp. A plane America didn't want had become a nightmare for Germany. To the Luftwaffe, the Airacobra wasn't a reject. It was a deadly threat that demanded respect. While the 37 Deers cannon stole the headlines, the P-39 had more to offer than just a big gun. Its balance between firepower, durability, and maneuverability made it a complete package for Soviet pilots. With additional 50 caliber and 30 caliber machine guns, it could unleash a storm of lead against enemy aircraft or ground targets. Its mid-engine design, though strange, gave it a solid center of gravity, making the plane stable during firing runs. This stability meant Soviet pilots could line up precise shots, a huge advantage when facing fast, agile German fighters. To the Americans, the P-39 seemed awkward and limited. To the Soviets, it was versatile, reliable, and lethal. By the middle of the war, Lend-Lease deliveries of P-39s had transformed Soviet air regiments. Squadrons once flying outdated or underpowered aircraft suddenly found themselves equipped with machines that could compete with the Luftwaffe on equal terms. For many Soviet pilots, the Airacobra became their first taste of a modern, well-equipped fighter. It wasn't just a plane. It was a symbol of international support, proof that even in their darkest hours, Allies were sending tools to help them fight. By 1943 and 1944, entire Soviet regiments proudly flew the Airacobra, and their kill tallies rose higher with each passing month. America might have dismissed the plane, but in Russia, it was rewriting the air war. After the war, the Airacobra faded into obscurity in the West. The U.S. remembered its Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Corsairs, the glamorous fighters that won glory in Europe and the Pacific. The Airacobra, by contrast, was quietly retired, remembered only as a failed experiment. But in Russia, its story was very different. Veterans spoke of it with respect, even affection. For many, it was the aircraft that carried them through the darkest days of the war. In Soviet memory, the P-39 was not a reject. It was a hero, a machine that helped secure victory against one of the most powerful air forces in history. The story of the P-39 Airacobra teaches a vital lesson. No weapon is useless if placed in the right hands, on the right battlefield. The Americans designed the plane for a kind of war they didn't end up fighting. The Soviets, facing a brutal low-altitude struggle, found in the Airacobra exactly what they needed. It's a reminder that context is everything. A plane mocked in one part of the world can be legendary in another. Technology alone doesn't win wars. Adaptation does. And the Soviets adapted better than anyone, transforming a so-called reject into a frontline weapon of victory. So, was the P-39 Airacobra a failure? In American skies, perhaps yes. But in Soviet skies, it was a predator, a beast that claimed thousands of kills and turned ordinary pilots into legends. The irony is unforgettable. The plane America didn't want became one of the Soviet Union's deadliest tools. History often hides these contradictions, but the truth is clear. The Airacobra was never just a reject. It was a survivor, a killer. A symbol of how desperation and adaptation can turn weakness into strength. And for those Soviet pilots who lived to tell their stories, the Airacobra wasn't America's failure at all. It was Russia's secret weapon,